What happens when beauty becomes a weapon against you? When the very industry that promises to make you a star becomes the machine that destroys you? Carré Otis had it all. The face that launched 1,000 campaigns. The body that graced magazine covers worldwide. She was the golden girl of the 90s modeling world. A Guess icon, a Hollywood wife, living the dream that millions of girls could only fantasize about. But behind the glossy magazine covers and red carpet appearances, a darker story was unfolding. A story the fashion industry desperately wanted to keep buried.
There was abuse, and there was enough of abuse to call it abuse.
For years, she stayed silent. The contracts, the NDAs, the threats, they all worked, until they didn't. So what really happened to Carré Otis? How did fashion's golden girl become the woman they tried to silence? And why did it take decades for the truth to finally see the light? This is the story they never wanted you to hear. In April 1986, a 17-year-old from San Francisco named Carré Otis appeared on the cover of Elle France. It was her first major magazine cover, and it changed everything. The fashion industry had discovered something rare, a face that could sell dreams. Within 2 years, Otis had become the face of Guess jeans. Those black and white campaigns, shot by photographer Wayne Mazer, turned her into a global icon. The images were striking, raw, sensual, unapologetically American. They made Guess a household name, and Carré one of the most recognizable faces of the late 80s. The numbers told the story. By 1988, she was earning $10,000 per day for fashion shoots. Her image dominated billboards, from Times Square to Sunset Boulevard. She landed covers for Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Cosmopolitan. Fashion photographers like Helmut Newton and Herb Ritz specifically requested her. She was, by every measure, the modeling world's newest golden girl. Behind that image, though, was a teenage girl battling forces she didn't yet understand. Carré would later describe those years as deeply disconnected, a time when she didn't know how to say no, didn't yet know what boundaries were, and felt herself unraveling even as the industry held her up as a star.
At 16, I knew, and being the Carré that I am and was, I knew I couldn't walk down that runway. My self-esteem was so low, I was actually underdeveloped. I was super shy. But the performer in me could.
But success in the modeling world has always come with a price. Industry insiders knew the reality. Most modeling careers lasted only 2 to 3 years. The pressure to stay thin, the grueling travel schedules, the constant scrutiny. It broke most girls before they even turned 25. Carré seemed different. She had what agents called staying power. Her bookings were consistent, her rates climbed, and every brand wanted a piece of her. By 1989, she was represented by Ford Models in New York, one of the most powerful agencies in the world. The lifestyle looked glamorous: private jets, 5-star hotels, designer wardrobes, photo shoots in the tropics. She partied with actors, musicians, and Hollywood royalty. But in reality, she was still just a teenager, trying to survive in a world that fed on obedience and silence. Even in those early years, the cracks were visible, if anyone had cared to look. Her eating became obsessive, her body a battleground. She felt pressure from all sides, to be sexy but innocent, compliant but successful, thin but strong. She started to lose touch with her real self, and the isolation began to grow. The unspoken rules of fashion in the late 80s were brutally clear. Be grateful, stay silent, and never question the men in charge. Agents dictated her schedule, decided who she met, what she wore, and how she behaved. The power imbalance was never hidden, just accepted. Carré Otis had climbed to the top of that world. She was living the dream that millions envied. But dreams, as she would soon discover, often came with a cost. Years later, when asked about that time, she would sum it up in a single line. People told me I had it all. I didn't have myself. By the time Carré was 20, the success that once felt like a miracle had begun to take its toll. She was burnt out, physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and quietly spiraling. After years of constant travel, restrictive diets, and intense pressure, she called her agent to say she needed a break. She checked into a wellness retreat and asked not to be disturbed, but halfway through her time off, the phone rang. They told her there was a movie role, a major opportunity she couldn't afford to miss. And Carré, still vulnerable, still lacking the support to say no, left the retreat and boarded a plane to Brazil. Looking back, she would call it a moment that changed everything.
I left retreat, and it was one of those moments I look back where I think, had I made a different decision, how different would my life be today? But I didn't make that decision. I took this movie, and I auditioned, I got it, and I stepped into something I'd never known.
In 1989, Carré was cast in Wild Orchid, an erotic drama directed by Zalman King and filmed largely in Brazil. It was her first major film role, and it came with high stakes. The movie starred Otis opposite Mickey Rourke, who was not only her co-star, but would soon become her real-life partner. For the tabloids, it was instant material, the guest model and the Hollywood bad boy. They called it a love story. But behind the headlines, the truth was far more complicated. Carré was just 20. Rourke was over a decade older and already infamous for his volatile behavior. What began as scripted intimacy on set soon blurred into something else entirely. Carré later revealed that during filming, particularly in one intimate scene, things happened that were not fully consensual. The script, the cameras, the power dynamics. It was all happening too fast and too real.
I was exploited. I was abused. I was used on that movie set. And actually, there were stills lifted that were sold to Playboy magazine against my wishes.
The production had already stripped her of control, but the fallout would go even deeper. When Wild Orchid premiered in 1990, critics focused on its eroticism and mixed artistic value. But Carré's identity in the public eye had changed overnight. She was no longer just a rising model. She was the woman Mickey Rourke couldn't stop talking about. Their relationship continued after filming wrapped, and within 2 years, they were married. But instead of a glamorous union between two stars, it became what Carré later described as a cycle of isolation, control, and fear.
And it was from this place where my self-esteem was so crushed that I accepted a proposal of marriage. Against my better judgment, knowing my voice was so sort of lost at that point, knowing that it was probably a really bad idea.
She later recalled how Rourke monitored her whereabouts, discouraged her friendships, and gradually closed her off from outside support. At times, she felt physically unsafe, but walking away wasn't easy, not in an industry that didn't protect women, especially not from powerful men. The people around her, agents, executives, stylists, offered little support. And as the public narrative focused more on the relationship than on her work, Carré's identity began to vanish behind his shadow. Casting agents referred to her as Mickey's girlfriend. Her booking slowed, her autonomy shrank. The once bright momentum of her modeling career dimmed under the weight of constant scrutiny and eroded self-worth. To the outside world, she kept up appearances, red carpets, smiles, fashion spreads. But inside, she was unraveling. The emotional trauma of the relationship, coupled with years of internalized pressure from the modeling world, pushed her deeper into disordered eating. She rarely felt grounded. Not in her body, not in her mind, and certainly not in her work. And through it all, she said nothing. Not to the media, not to her agents, not even to most of her friends. Carré later explained that she had been told directly that if she spoke out, she would lose everything. Contracts, opportunities, protection. You don't talk about this, they said. If you do, it's over. So she didn't. That silence stretched for years. But eventually, something shifted. In 1998, Carré filed for divorce. It was a step toward freedom, but it wasn't a clean slate. By then, Her career had stalled, her physical and emotional health had deteriorated, and she had almost entirely disappeared from the spotlight. The woman once sold to the world as an ideal, the guest girl, the cover star, the sultry new actress, had been reduced to a public footnote. Behind the image, Carré Otis was struggling to survive. And the true reckoning, the process of understanding everything she had endured, was only just beginning. If the relationship with Mickey Rourke nearly destroyed Carré Otis's sense of safety, what happened before and after it would challenge her sense of self. Long before she ever stepped onto a movie set, Carré had already been subjected to an environment where power imbalances were normalized, and silence was the cost of survival. She was just 17 when she was sent to Paris to model for Elite. At the time, Gerald Marie, the head of Elite Model Management Europe, was one of the most influential men in fashion. He had launched the careers of Linda Evangelista, Naomi Campbell, and countless others. He was also, as later investigations and testimonies would reveal, at the center of a disturbing pattern of abuse. Carré would later publicly accuse Marie of sexually assaulting her during her earliest days in Paris, at a time when she had no protection, no voice, and no understanding of how deep the system of complicity really ran.
I was told that I needed to stay in my new agent's apartment. Within the first night, I woke up with my agent on top of me, and I would have to endure these visitations for the months to come.
At the time, there was no one she could turn to. Complaints against men like Marie rarely went anywhere. Whispers were silenced. Accusations vanished. Agencies closed ranks around their star executives, and models who spoke out were often blacklisted or simply disappeared from the casting boards.
My voice was so suppressed at that point that I couldn't speak up.
Carré's response, like so many others, was to internalize, to comply, to make herself smaller, physically, emotionally, and literally. In her TEDx speech, she recalls standing on hotel bathroom tiles as a teenager, measuring the width of her thighs each morning. Her body was her only perceived source of value, and controlling it felt like the only power she had. The eating disorders that had already started in her late teens became a daily obsession. On paper, she was the epitome of success. In reality, she was starving, in more ways than one. Her weight became a constant topic of negotiation. Designers and photographers praised her for being strong-looking, but that didn't mean she was exempt from the pressures of thinness. Like so many women in fashion, she learned to live off caffeine, nicotine, and praise. She had not yet learned to love herself. And in her words, no one had ever taught her that loving herself even mattered. Meanwhile, her agents, the very people who were supposed to protect her, often ignored the warning signs. When she was too thin to work, they booked her anyway. When she landed in the hospital, they covered it up. Carré later revealed that at her lowest point, she had to be hospitalized for heart complications related to anorexia, yet her agency made no effort to slow her schedule or address the root cause. The culture of silence extended far beyond Carré. In the 1990s, the modeling world operated like a closed system, insular, image-obsessed, and hostile to dissent. The power of agencies like Elite or Ford couldn't be overstated. They controlled visas, housing, job bookings, and press access. For young models, especially those from working-class backgrounds, that meant total dependency. You didn't speak up. You didn't ask questions. You certainly didn't say no. Contracts were binding. NDAs were common. And older men, agents, executives, photographers, often blurred the lines between professional mentorship and personal exploitation. What happened behind closed doors rarely made it into the glossy pages of fashion magazines. The stories were passed quietly between models, shared in dressing rooms or whispered backstage, always with the same unspoken understanding. No one would believe you, and even if they did, nothing would change. Carré Otis carried these experiences with her for decades. In interviews, she described the psychological toll of being made to feel both hyper-visible and entirely voiceless. She had been seen by millions, photographed by the most famous lensmen in the world. And yet, she had never felt more invisible. As her marriage to Rourke unraveled and her physical health declined, Carré found herself at a crossroads. She was in her early 30s, divorced, struggling with addiction, and nearly unrecognizable from the woman who had once defined an era. The fashion industry had discarded her as quickly as it had embraced her. The silence that once protected powerful men was now suffocating her. This wasn't just a personal crisis. It was the cumulative result of years of systemic neglect and unspoken trauma. And, for the first time, Carré began to question the rules she had once accepted as fact. What if the shame wasn't hers to carry? What if the silence wasn't strength? It would still take years for her to speak publicly. But something had shifted. The illusion was broken. The fear, though still present, had begun to crack, and once she started naming what had happened, there was no going back. By the early 2000s, that quiet shift had grown into a deeper transformation. Carré Otis had disappeared from the fashion world, no longer on magazine covers, the phone no longer ringing. But behind the stillness, her life was unraveling and, piece by piece, rebuilding itself. After years of battling disordered eating, emotional abuse, and industry burnout, her body had reached its limit. She had been hospitalized for heart complications and chronic malnutrition, and she was struggling with substance use as a way to cope with pain she hadn't yet named. The woman who had once been held up as a symbol of power and sensuality could barely get out of bed. For the first time, Carré Otis wasn't just stepping away from fashion. She was fighting to stay alive. It wasn't one singular moment that saved her. It was a slow, painful process of letting go, first of the agents who had controlled her, then of the relationship that had broken her, and eventually of the silence that had defined her. She moved to Colorado, away from the fashion capitals, away from the chaos. It was there that she began to rebuild, far from the cameras that had once dictated every part of her life. She turned to Buddhism. She started therapy. And slowly, she began to confront the truth behind the image that had made her famous. Later, she reflected on how for years she had disassociated from her own body, performing strength on the outside while quietly unraveling inside. But in Colorado, she began the work of re-embodiment, understanding that her body was hers again, that she didn't have to live in survival mode.
I also realized how utterly disconnected I was from my body and my sexuality. I began to put the pieces of myself back together like a puzzle. And I began to reclaim my voice.
She began to speak to other women, survivors of abuse, former models, people who had watched her from afar and quietly wondered where she had gone. The conversations were difficult, but they gave her something the industry had never offered: solidarity. She wasn't alone. She never had been. Still, telling her story wasn't easy. The fear of retaliation, legal or reputational, had been drilled into her for years. But something had shifted in her. She no longer wanted to protect the people or systems that had harmed her. She wanted to protect the girl she had once been, the 17-year-old in Paris who didn't know she was allowed to say no. That clarity became the foundation of a new chapter. Not a return to fashion, but a return to herself. She married again, this time to someone outside of Hollywood. She had children. She found stability. And with that came the decision that would change everything. She was finally ready to tell the truth. In 2011, Carré Otis published her memoir, Beauty Disrupted. For the first time, the world heard her story, in her own words, on her own terms. She wrote about the abuse, the exploitation, the addiction, the eating disorders. She named names, and in doing so, She shattered the illusion that had followed her for decades. The book didn't just reclaim her voice. It cracked open the industry's carefully controlled silence. For decades, fashion had profited off Carré's image while ignoring the reality behind it. Now, there was no more plausible deniability. She told the truth with dates, names, contracts, hospital visits. She exposed the cost of survival in an industry that glorified youth, silence, and thinness, and erased the women who paid the price. Suddenly, the guest girl from the billboards had a voice, and she wasn't holding back. Of course, some people praised her, others questioned her motives, a few tried to discredit her completely. But honestly, after everything she'd survived, who could blame her for speaking now, and not a second earlier? She didn't just stop at the book. Carré got involved with the Model Alliance, pushing for real change, legal protections, safer work conditions, actual accountability. For once, she was using her name not to sell an image, but to protect the next generation. And in the background, her life was changing too. She left the fashion capitals, moved to Colorado, got married again, and had children. She slowly returned to modeling, but this time, it was on her own terms. No crash diets, no retouching, no pretending. Just a woman who had been through it all and was finally in control. When new allegations surfaced against Gerald Marie in 2020, Carré stood with the survivors. She reaffirmed her own experience, called out the systems that had protected men like him for so long, and made it clear that even if the legal system couldn't act, the truth would still be heard. These days, she lives deliberately. And when she speaks to the next generation, her message is simple. You don't have to suffer to be successful.